Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm starting a new project. Rather than respond to a creationist video, I will instead present a creationist argument and then do a deep dive on why this argument doesn't actually work. I plan on doing this for several creationist arguments eventually, but I am starting this project while my brain is addled with a COVID infection that I picked up on vacation. It's my punishment for leaving Canada in the coldest week of the winter so far this year, I guess. So it is possible that I'm just not thinking straight and this whole thing is just a bad idea that should be forgotten about. Only time will tell. And, as you can probably tell from my voice, I still have COVID, so I am not in a state of mind to tell you whether or not it's a good idea yet. Today, we're going to be talking about irreducible complexity. Yes, I did cover it in a short just a few weeks ago, and in a response video just after that, but the short was, well, too short to do the topic justice, and the response video didn't exclusively stick to that topic, so hopefully this will be interesting and unique enough to warrant your attention. I'm really good at these catchy intros when I have COVID. The outtakes are going to be fun for this one at least, because I can't do anything right the first take. Yeah, anyway, let's get on to the video!
But first, a word from our sponsor, Surfshark.
Hey Tim, how you doing?
Not good, Rhino. I'm not good.
Oh, what's up?
I wish I'd just taken your advice and signed up for Surfshark VPN last month, but I got distracted.
What do you mean distracted? It's super easy to sign up. You can do it with just a few clicks.
You know how sports betting has gotten really big recently?
Yeah.
Well, my area just legalized sports betting, and I was overwhelmed with all these offers, giving me free trials and sign-up bonuses and special offers that were just for me. They weren't special. They weren't just for me. I thought I was special to them, but I was just another person they were tracking. I feel like there was a target on my back. Because there was a target on my back. I was being targeted.
Lost your shirt, huh?
Yeah. Pants, too. I should have downloaded Surfshark VPN so I could disguise my location and not be such an easy target. Now I owe Mom money again. Like, she's gonna cut me off eventually. Like, I probably wasted more money than it would have cost me to get Surfshark.
Oh yeah, a few times over. For a limited time, listeners can actually get Surfshark VPN at surfshark.deals/Rhino using code Rhino at 83% off with 3 extra months for free. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's actually no risk to try it out.
Oh?
Not only is it cost-effective, but like I said, it's super easy to sign up with just a few simple clicks.
I can do that.
Besides saving you a lot of money, Surfshark allows you to surf the internet anonymously and location-free by masking your IP address, allowing you to access 3,200 servers across 100 different countries. They also have the Clean Web feature, which will block the ad trackers that have been, hunting you down recently. So you use Surfshark and the sports betting guys won't even know where to find or tempt you.
How do I get started?
Sign up today at surfshark.deals/Rhino, and don't forget to use promo code Rhino to get 83% off and 3 extra months for free.
Thanks, Rhino.
I use Surfshark VPN to protect myself online, and you should too.
Yeah, probably be the first winning decision I'd made all week.
So to continue my theme this week of not being interesting, I should really rethink this theme. Anyway, I'll start in the most banal way possible. Creation.com defines irreducible complexity as a term used to describe a characteristic of certain complex systems whereby they need all of their individual component parts in place in order to function. In other words, it's impossible to reduce the complexity of, or to simplify, an irreducibly complex system by removing any of its component parts and still maintaining its functionality. So the idea is that for a system to be irreducibly complex, the whole system will cease to function if one piece is removed. As a common example of irreducible complexity, the creationists will often turn to the mousetrap, which is rather amusing since we're supposed to be looking at complex systems and instead start with quite a simple system. The fact that this is the common go-to example serves to demonstrate the fatal flaw in the argument. The more complex a system is, the more likely it is to be able to function while missing pieces. It might not function optimally, but it will still function. To use another creationist go-to, take the eye. The eye actually is a complex system, and as such, despite creationist protestations, there are actually several fairly important pieces that could be removed while still leaving a mostly functional eye. The existence of people with color blindness shows us that if you remove one of the types of cone cells, the eye still functions perfectly adequately. It just doesn't perceive the same range of colors as an eye with all 3 types of cone cells. The existence of aniridia, which is a condition that causes a baby to be born without irises, shows us that eyes will still work without the extremely important iris. People with aniridia can still see, but they are much more sensitive to light and sudden changes of light levels, and have a higher likelihood of developing other eye problems throughout their lives. So you remove the part of the eye, the iris, and it still functions. Again, not optimally, but it still functions. Now, there are other conditions where other parts of the eye can be missing and the eye still more or less functions as an eye, but the ability to demonstrate even one such case shows conclusively that eyes are not, in fact, irreducibly complex. So now let's look in the other direction. Our eyes actually show evidence of having had more complexity in the past than they do today, meaning that they actually have been reduced from a more complex organ. We have, in the corner of our eyes, a little pink fold of skin. These little pink folds of skin are the evolutionary leftovers of our ancestors' nictitating membranes, the membranes that for some animals serves as transparent protective layer that allows them to see underwater or while digging in the ground, or just occasionally sweeping over the eyes to clean and moisturize them. And we know that these are the leftovers of nictitating membranes because sometimes babies are born with atavisms that cause them to actually partially develop into nictitating membranes. It's incredibly rare, but it does happen. And so it goes for all the biological examples that creationists give of irreducible complexity. Every single one ends up not actually being irreducibly complex if you spend any amount of time studying the scientific literature. And this hasn't even touched on the fact that the argument assumes that the function of the irreducibly complex thing must remain constant. We know that evolution has a tendency to repurpose structures and organs to fill a role that they did not originally fill. Since this is something that happens with evolution, then when looking for something that is irreducibly complex, we should also be looking for potential alternative functions that could be served by part or parts of that structure. Now, this brings us back to the mousetrap, because at the end of the day, when dealing with an actual complex structure, it becomes clear fairly quickly that it can still function without some parts, or that parts of it could have had different functions. So we need to get it down to something that actually is simple. So we go back to the mousetrap. It's got the spring, hammer, baseplate, holding bar, and catch. Take any one away, and it will cease to function as a mousetrap. Now, for argument's sake, I will be ignoring the reduced mousetraps that were suggested and built by Dr. John MacDonald of the University of Delaware, so just pretend like those don't exist. So we have a 5-part simple system that is standing in for a biological system of some kind. Dr. Michael Behe, who coined the term irreducible complexity in the first place, says that it's meant to be analogous to something like a bacterial flagellum. But if we look at the bacterial flagellum, it's significantly more complex than a mousetrap. Just by the number of components on a simplified diagram, there were 30 different proteins listed for the flagellum. So there's 6 times as many pieces working together in the flagellum than in the mousetrap. Which then gets us back to the fact that a complex system is more likely going to be able to function with missing parts than a simple one. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about just how the flagellum evolved. Instead, I'll just leave a link down below to a paper on the stepwise formation of the bacterial flagellar system if you're curious. But the main thing that I want to look at here are the labels given to the different parts of the flagellum on diagrams that don't go down to the protein level. There's a little spot there that's called the type 3 secretion system. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the flagellum is basically a little tail on a cell that it can wiggle around and cause the cell to move. The type 3 secretion system is, as the name implies, a system that the bacterium uses to secrete things, usually effector proteins into a host cell. Now, those of you who are paying attention might have noticed that injecting their own proteins into other cells is not the same as growing a tail to wiggle around with. So yeah, remember how I said like 30 seconds ago that the function of the system does not have to remain the same throughout the evolutionary process? That's not quite how I worded it, but that's what I was getting at. Now, before I talk about this, I do just want to preface it by pointing out that evolutionary processes do not have an end goal in mind, so in any analogies that I'll be making, the mousetrap or otherwise, just understand that they are not going to be perfect analogies. Nature did not try to get a bacterial flagellum and so plan ahead to add parts to the type 3 secretion system in order to reach that goal. It's just that every step in the process between the type 3 secretion system and the bacterial flagellum involves something that was at least slightly useful to the organism in terms of reproductive success. There are a potentially infinite number of structures that could have evolved and would have been incredibly useful, but did not because the mutations that would have led down those paths just didn't happen. This is what actually makes it look like it's directed, so if we start with the finished product and then assume that it was the only way it could have happened and work our way back, but in reality we don't know how many different potential paths evolution could have taken us, and we never will. This is often a criticism that creationists will make of evolution. If it wasn't directed, then how did it get to a finished product in the first place? Well, the simple answer is that it didn't. Evolution is a continuous process. It's still happening today. Sure, some things seem to be persistent over evolutionary time with little to no change, but that's because sometimes a structure just works, and there aren't really any further ways to improve on it. Evolution is not in the habit of reinventing the wheel. Side note, that's actually one of the ways that we can tell the difference between a similarity due to homology as opposed to convergent evolution. If it accomplishes the same thing but in a different way, then it's likely because they evolved independently. So for instance, looking at eyes again, once an eye evolves, if there's something wrong with the way that it did evolve, it's more difficult for evolution to go back and do something different to these existing eyes to fix it than it would be just to start from scratch and build the eye in a new way. Which is why we can tell that our eyes evolved independently from, say, the compound eyes of insects. Because while evolution won't reinvent an already existing wheel, it will invent the wheel multiple times when it's a useful structure for an organism's environment, and each time it does so, because it relies on a certain degree of randomness in the mutation process, it will do it in a different way. Anyway, back to the mousetrap analogy. Sure, it's got 5 parts, and the removal of any one part will make it cease to function as a mousetrap, if we're ignoring Dr. McDonald's actually working mousetraps all the way down to one with just a spring, but we are ignoring those, so let's keep going. But as has been pointed out by Dr. Kenneth Miller, you can use a mousetrap with just the spring, hammer, and base plate as a clamp. In his example, he used it as a tie clip, but you could use it to temporarily hold papers together, as a money clip, a chip clip, a toothpaste tube holder, or any number of other functions. Evolution will use existing structures for new functions. That's kinda its whole thing. And it's something we've actually seen happen, such as when a population of lizards that were moved to a new island in 1971 developed cecal valves in the gut to create a fermentation chamber that assisted with the digestion of plant matter. It was just a small change, essentially just the pinching off of a section of their intestines, but this pinching off allowed for the development of the fermentation chamber, which allowed the lizards to absorb more nutrients from the plants that they were eating as part of their new diet in their new environment, with the mainland ancestors eating mostly insects. Now, I feel like it's important to mention here that Dr. Michael Behe, the father of the argument from irreducible complexity, actually does accept evolution. He just thinks that God guided it. That's not how his argument gets used in most cases. It's usually creationists like Answers in Genesis who outright deny evolution that are using the argument from irreducible complexity. But if you call Dr. Behe a creationist, he'll get upset and write articles about how no, he is not in fact a creationist, he accepts common descent, he just thinks that the evidence for design is empirically detectable. It's actually quite amusing. When you find an Answers in Genesis article covering Dr. Ken Miller, they make a big deal right at the top of the article about how he's a Catholic evolutionist. How icky. But when you find an article on Michael Behe, who is also a Catholic evolutionist, if by those words you mean he is a Catholic and accepts the theory of evolution, it only mentions that he's a Catholic in passing toward the end of the article, and does so in a way that suggests that he left his faith mostly out of his book, Darwin's Black Box, to make the book more appealing to a secular scientific audience, and they praise the fact that he has made it necessary for intelligent design to be accounted for in the scientific struggle to explain away God and his creation. So, when it's a guy they disagree with, Catholic Church bad. But when it's a guy they do agree with, Catholic means he agrees that the real God is the God of the Bible, so obviously his work is to be respected, even if they do have denominational differences. Anyway, all that to say that Dr. Behe likely agrees with the scientific conclusion about the processes involved in the evolution of the flagellum. He just doesn't think that they could have happened naturally for some reason, even though the research shows rather the opposite. So if we really give the argument from irreducible complexity its fair shake, it, rather ironically, makes the argument weaker, at least from the young Earth creationist perspective. This is because the Steelman version of irreducible complexity doesn't even rise to the level of being an argument from ignorance. It all just comes down to a difference of opinion as to whether a feature that we know evolved could have done so without supernatural intervention. At best, it leaves us wondering about abiogenesis. Sure, all the biological systems that are around today are complex, and as we've seen, complex biological systems all seem to have a myriad of things that could be altered without drastically impacting the function of the system, so when we take this to its logical conclusion, that leads us to the distant past, when life actually would have been simple enough to qualify as irreducibly complex. But then this just gets us back to it being an argument from ignorance again. We don't know the specifics of how abiogenesis happened, therefore the first organism was irreducibly complex, irreducibly simple, therefore God did it. The problem is that we don't actually know what degree of complexity the first thing that we would have called an organism had. If there's a point at which it actually becomes truly irreducible, it could well be before it had the characteristics of what we would actually call life, just a series of chemical reactions. But then we're left with the fact that even if I grant that this proto-life was irreducibly complex and needed all of its parts to be together simultaneously, the Earth was never some homogeneous blob of one single chemical. There comes a point where the chemicals required for this proto-life would have just been there together, because sometimes chemicals will exist in places in close proximity to other chemicals. In fact, that's the norm rather than the exception. You don't find pure substances in nature, you find muddled up mixtures. So at its core, the argument from irreducible complexity reduces itself to an argument from irreducible simplicity, and it can plausibly get to a point where all the necessary components exist together just because that's how existence works. Sometimes things are together. But here, I will admit that my counter is at its weakest, because we don't actually know the specifics of the process of abiogenesis, so I can't say for certain that there is not a step along the way where irreducible simplicity actually would provide an insurmountable barrier. I mean, thus far in Origin of Life research, such a barrier is not indicated, but that doesn't mean it's not there. But then this again renders Behe's argument an argument from ignorance, so do with that what you will. The example I used in my short was of a car engine running without one of its spark plugs. Well, as it turns out, this is actually not the best example, because there are parts of a car engine that you could remove that would render the whole thing useless in one fell swoop. And we're ignoring that the argument from irreducible complexity doesn't actually specify which part you remove, so it doesn't matter that there is a critical part as long as there is a non-critical part, but let's put that aside. But anyway, what I'm trying to do here is highlight a key difference between designed and undesigned systems. A well-designed system will only be as complex as is necessary to get the job done, and no more. So while there might be some redundancy built in as a safeguard against the failure of certain parts, there will be parts that are 100% essential to the operation that cannot be removed. But in an undesigned system, you find unnecessary redundancies, superfluous parts, and other inefficiencies caused by the evolutionary development process. And this is actually a key part of how evolution works in the first place. Because natural selection can only act on that which is already there, there has to be something there in order for it to act on. But evolution likes to take things that serve one function and then repurpose them for another function. But what if the function it was serving was something critical? Well, then if a mutation caused it to serve the second function without having anything in place to serve the first function, that organism would likely not be reproductively successful. So evolution will work with what it already has, modify it for new purposes, while leaving old copies of it fulfilling the original purpose. Sometimes the organism out-evolves the need for the original purpose, at which point it is free to either develop a new purpose without worrying about maintaining the old one, or to become a vestigial structure. And so in biological systems, we see all sorts of these redundancies that evolution is then free to work with that just don't exist in designed systems like human engines or mousetraps. And just to reiterate, evolution does not actually have intentions. I've been anthropomorphizing it when I talk about it that way because when we see a structure that has evolved, it's easiest to conceptualize the evolutionary process in terms of what steps had to happen to get from point A to point B, knowing that point B is the endpoint. But evolution did not know that point B was the endpoint. Evolution doesn't know anything or plan anything. It just happens. So it did end up at point B, but not because that's where it was trying to get. That's just how the cookie crumbled. So yeah, as I see it, there are three main problems for irreducible complexity. The fact that complex systems are just, by their very nature, more likely to be reducible than simple systems. The fact that evolution repurposes structures on a regular basis, meaning that we don't need to show how a structure could be reduced while serving the exact same function the whole time. And the fact that the strongest steel man of the argument essentially gets us to a position where maybe supernatural invention was needed to start life off, but also maybe not. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Lady Doomsinger, who says, "The whole city analogy of the cell always gives me a chuckle. These people are so obsessed with explaining how the body is irreducibly complex, they forget that cities are in fact not irreducibly complex. Cities always begin with a single structure. It's literally a common proverb. Rome wasn't built in a day." I love this. This gave me one of those I hadn't thought of that before, but now that you mention it, it's completely obvious moments. Creationists go for the wow factor and how complicated the cells are, saying it's like a city with transport systems, waste management, production facilities, energy stations, etc., etc. Well, do you think that any city had all of that when the first person settled there? I mean, maybe to a degree, but not the large, complex systems required by a modern city. Yeah, the initial camp of people that settled in a location that would eventually become a city probably had a way of disposing of their waste, but they didn't have sewage treatment plants, landfills, people whose job it is to collect garbage, etc., etc. They would have had a simpler, more primitive version of waste management that might not look anything like the modern version, and definitely would not have worked if you tried to scale it up to a modern city. The modern version of it grew and evolved organically over time. Well, the simpler cells of First Life probably did not have all the city-esque systems of the modern cell, but they would have had simpler systems that would have met their needs at the time in a similar way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to surfshark.deals/Rhino and use code Rhino at checkout for 83% off a Surfshark subscription. A super duper special thanks to Milo from Oregon, or Oregon, or Oregon. I don't know. Y'all always correct me on how I say it every time I say it, so I'm just going to say it all three ways from now on. Anyway, Milo completely unexpectedly bought a really expensive and amazing lens off of my Amazon wishlist. Like, seriously, Milo, you fucking rock. I don't even tell people that I have a wishlist anymore. I only added the lens to the wishlist so that I'd remember which one I decided to buy once I saved up enough money to buy it. Never in a million years did I actually expect it to show up unannounced in my P.O. box. Hopefully y'all can see how much sharper the image is now. It's hard for script writing me to tell for sure, but from what I can see on my monitor right now, it already looks way better than the lens that came with the camera. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorship manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Gordito1981, Aaron Shropshire, and all the rest, who are the part to the simple system that is my channel. If you'd like to be a critical piece of my system, the removal of which will cause it to cease functioning, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, I already have a lens, thanks. No need to send that one again. Thanks, Milo. My P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time. To a paper on the stepwise formation of the bacterial flagellar system. Bacterial flagellar system. Bacterial flagellar... What the fuck was I thinking when I wrote that? With their mainland ancestors eating mostly insects. I fucking did an off-script aside to explain what I already explained in the script because I'm a fucking idiot when whatever. But then we're left with the fact that even if I grant that this proto-life was irreducibly I can't even say the topic anymore. Irreducibly complex. Irreducibly complex. Irreducibly complex. Irreducibly complex. So I can't say for certain that there is not a step along the way where irreducible simplicity actually would provide an insurmountable barrier. That was bad. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorship manager. He's my sponsorship manner.